Thank you, everybody, for attending. I just spent the last 3 minutes wondering if the subtitle was grammatically correct, and I've convinced myself that it is. The answer is, I just left off the R in the database. The answer's in the database. But thank you for attending. So we're going to talk about a topic, governance, risk, and compliance, which you're hearing a lot more about these days. And I often wonder why these three letters go together. So I spent a lot of time constructing, okay, why do we put these three letters together in one acronym? Let's start with the obligatory definition of GRC. I believe I found this on Wikipedia, and I won't read the whole thing to you. I highlighted certain things in bold. We know it's coordinated. It covers a lot of broad issues within an organization. It's enterprise level. It's typically something within a large enterprise. And regulatory requirements are a driver. This definition speaks more specifically around that regulatory requirements are the driver. But I don't believe they're the only driver. I think there's a broader definition of why we do GRC. If you were listening to David's keynote earlier, it's not surprising. It's not just about regulators forcing us to do things. I like to put it in layman's terms and in layman's drawing. This is about as well as I could draw, period. This is about governance. It's the stuff you do to mitigate risk and manage compliance. Risk is the bad stuff you don't want to happen. Compliance is stuff you have to do because somebody says so. Plain and simple. So that's why these three letters are together. And if we look at the drivers of risk and compliance, why they exist in the first place, well, risk market dynamics can impact an organization's risk. We saw things happen around 2008 in capital markets and financial services where market dynamics really turned up the dial on risk significantly. And of course, the unexpected. Everybody's always trying to guess what the unexpected is, right? The unknown unknowns, I guess. And compliance, they come from regulatory bodies as well as legislative bodies. So sometimes it's more of a little bit more than guidelines from a regulatory body. It's not necessarily law, but certainly some level of control over an organization, and then legislation itself. So those are the things that influence risk and compliance. How are they related? Well, risk and compliance is an interesting point to bring up, that there's a correlation between the two. I just talked about what happened in 2008, and Gary earlier mentioned that there's a dialing down of compliance here in the U.S. So there's thinking, okay, well, maybe I don't have to worry about it if all of my business is in the U.S. But an argument can be made that as compliance requirements go down, risk goes up. And that's exactly what happened in 2008. It was a very less regulated environment than it was today. And it's not to make a direct correlation that, compliance fixes everything. But there is a correlation in behaviors where the less you have to worry about, the more you could innovate. And unless you're doing your own internal governance around your innovation, you can get into trouble. So what I posit here is that this is a pseudo-mathematical function, that your governance is directly proportional to some function of your risk and compliance, and that this is relatively constant, the R and the C. If there's not a lot of compliance, there's still a lot of risk you have to worry about. So therefore, you have to have the same amount of governance of your data and your information if you're a large enterprise. What David talked about earlier is the more data you have, the more context you need around that data to support the decisions that you make. So let's look at some industry perspectives, because I mentioned we're going to talk about industry today, and more words, right? So I just put some quotes from, we'll start with banking. BCBS 239 are a set of guidelines that have come out of the European Union, Basel. That's what the beast, it's the, I forget, but the Banking Committee on Regulation. Did we lose the audio? Okay, we're good. Basel Committee. Thank you for pointing out that who pointed out that I have the acronym as my first bullet. Thank you, right, that was good. Yeah, look at my own slide. The Basel Committee on Banking Supervision. And it's guidelines that focus on transparency. And this is where regulators actually talk a lot about data itself. If you look at some of the regulation, even in the turn of the millennium compared to some of the regulation that's coming out today, there's a lot of specifics about data and IT in the regulation today. They're really getting into defining what the models need to look like. If you look at it here, metadata, mentions of metadata, and why it's important. So it's right there in the regulation that people are talking about IT. And not surprisingly, there are folks in regulatory agencies that actually come from banking who are telling them, hey, this is what we need to do. And a focus on quality of the data and calling out specifically the IT functions. So they're getting very, very explicit. And then going over to MiFID II, MiFIR, Gary talked about this earlier. This is from the European Union, more focus on transparency, pushing banks to open venues to say, we want to see all the trades. Okay, so that's good. So that gets the sort of business out in the open, but also expanded reporting, requiring banks to provide more information, more fields, but a stricter review of that information. Transparency is important. And then, of course, a focus on reference data. These codification of things, entities, counterparties, and instruments, and recognizing that the linkages between all the data is very important. Healthcare and life sciences, there's what I like to think of as a digital remastering and a focus on outcomes. There's a lot about outcomes, right? It's about, we need to look holistically at how people are doing, not the specifics about the reductionist prescriptive approach to say, if this very siloed condition appears, this is what you have to do. It's more of a holistic approach now. To support a holistic 360-degree view of patients, you really have to get smart about your data. And so there's a big digital remastering going on to meet those needs. In life sciences, real-world evidence. Again, to ensure that there's quality to the data to support the analysis. It's not just about numbers in isolation or studies in isolation. It's let's take a look at how things happen in the real world. And the data that comes from the real world is not as neat and tidy as the data that you might create to support an experiment in a lab. And then every industry is concerned about security and privacy these days. There are cyber threats, insider threats that were mentioned earlier, information leaks, and this is also making its way into regulation. If you do business in the European Union, there's a global data protection regulation. Okay, see, I got that acronym without even having help on my own slide. You know, you remember some things and not others. And that's a cross-industry regulation coming from the EU that essentially says, if you think about it, every individual becomes a regulator to their own data. I can prescribe what is done to my data. So think about that complexity for a moment. Forget about a regulator saying this class of data has to be reported on this way and needs to be protected in this particular way. Now imagine an entire population of an entire continent saying, you know what? This is what I want shared about my data. This is what I don't want shared. And when you have the regulation in place, you have to comply with it. So kind of a big deal that adds to the complexity of what any industry faces. And every large enterprise does business multinationally. And so the European Union is going to factor into their portfolio. And then there's another point. So we talked about regulation. We talked about legislative bodies, regulating agencies, and individuals performing regulation on their own data. But this is interesting. Incumbents facing existential threats. So we like to think of innovation and regulation as like these different things. That I've got to innovate. I'm not going to be bound by any regulation. But innovation is protection against, we could call it existential risk management. And it's not easy to do if you're a large incumbent in an organization. Publishers have to face this down. In fact, not surprisingly, MarkLogic got involved early on with the publishing industry, helping them face the innovator's dilemma having to do with digitization. More recently, retailers, just read the news, retailers are facing existential threats. And I won't even name names because it's kind of unfair, but you just need to look at the news, and the inability to innovate is the ultimate risk. Insurers are up next, but they're actually being much more proactive in that they're recognizing that they're trusted by their customers with their data. And they're sitting on a lot of information that is going to enable them to innovate if only they can get value out of that information. And so they're going through a digital reinvention where the consumers that the new consumers of the next generation are digital first. So in many ways, they're taking up the similar journey that publishers did. They've got to digitize all their information and reach out to their audiences differently. So what's the common thread? It's kind of easy, you could probably guess. It's all about the data. It's all about the data. Everything about GRC, you could reduce it down to getting right with your data. Specifically around integrating that data. Okay, because if you don't have to integrate disparate information, eventually you can get control over it. But when you're continually integrating new bits of data in new ways, you have to be very agile. And this is my second pseudo-mathematical formula. The success or failure of corporate GRC is directly proportional to the success or failure of data governance within an organization. So we could scope down this discussion to, and hopefully I've proved it, that GRC is all about data governance. So let's go to another data governance definition. This is the third or fourth one today. I think David had two, and then two from industry, and then he added a third. I'll just add another one. And I highlight some specific words here to make a point in that there's a lot of mention about procedures and plans to execute those procedures when people talk about data governance. And that really resonates with me, not necessarily in a positive way. I've spent 27 years in IT, mostly in the data industry, and data governance can be a very laborious process with respect to planning and procedures. And not because it shouldn't involve that, but just because the ways in which that we have to execute on those procedures are not very straightforward. Start with this point. If you think about governing your data because a regulator has said something that has instituted a policy, the life cycle is going to look something like this. Regulation comes out. Okay, cool, we got a regulation. What do we do about it? They get a bunch of people together and they review the policy. Say, okay, now we know what the regulation is, and we're going to come up with some policies that people have to follow. So those are the policies. Then processes and programs start. Stakeholders are identified. This sounds familiar. So you're chuckling. I love that. That's great. Okay, so hey, we've got a solution for this. So we've got some stakeholders. I'll actually post your picture on the next one. And your name is, I'm sorry, I should know. Archon. Okay, Archie, I like it. Okay, so Archie here lives this. Okay, but we're not done, Archie. There's more. So processes and programs come out, stakeholders are identified, and then a bunch of workflows start. Okay, a lot of workflows, and then requirements come out of those workflows. And the app owners, what happened to the app owners in the slide? I have no idea what happened to the app owners. I guess they got old and grew beards, which is an unintended. I did not put that animation, but that's what happened. They got old and grew beards as a result of waiting for the requirements based on that regulation. Thank you for whoever did that to the slide. And finally, based on these requirements, they rewrite some apps, they write some code, they write some ETL, and eventually the data is changed. Yay. And if that's just one jurisdiction and one set of regulations, you might be able to manage that. But large enterprises work across multiple jurisdictions, so you get things like this. And if you've been around MarkLogic World before and you've seen some of our presentations, we have slides similar to these that show the data ETL workflow. Just apply, the same principle applies to policies. This sort of Rube Goldberg workflow is what we face from a data governance perspective. Yet governance is getting much more complicated. And the stakes are getting much higher. And we're still doing this. It's kind of scary when you think about it. Okay, so let's look at it from an innovation perspective. Hey, I'm an innovator. I got a clean slate. Or, better yet, I'm an incumbent, and we're going to start a little task force where they're going to borrow from the innovators and do all the fancy stuff they do, and we're going to change our business. Because that's where it really, if you're a true greenfield innovator, you do have an advantage. But if you're an incumbent and you've got existing business models to protect and existing regulatory pressures that you just can't ignore, it gets a little more challenging. But a lot of incumbents have done this. So this is how it works from an innovator's perspective. A bandwagon shows up. Okay. People jump on. I guess the same people with the beards. We'll have to take a look at this. So yes, the people who got old waiting for the regulation requirements to come, they jump on the bandwagon. They park at a lake. We'll call it Lake Hand Wavy. People jump in the lake. Hey, it's great. We're in the lake. Wonderful. And then how's the water? They find out that, you know what, there are some quality issues maybe with things in the lake. And the approach is to either ignore the governance entirely or address it later. And what that really devolves to is you've just added another silo of data to govern after the fact. And you've added a pretty large silo of data, and you still have to go through this process. And that's what happens when you don't address governance up front, first point of integration. But it's hard to do the old way. It really is. So it's much easier to just mash it all together and worry about later. What if you could have the best of both worlds? That's our point. So let's take a quick comparison of these two approaches, right? We've got speed to integrate. The regulatory approach is very slow. The integration coverage is very low because you're trying to govern up front, so you don't integrate as much. The innovators, they integrate things quickly, and the coverage of what they integrate is very high. But what happens is, because they're not doing any governance, the overall governance coverage is low. It's the same, regardless. So what I put here in bold, what we want is we want to integrate quickly, cover a lot of data, not make compromises around what we integrate, but still engage in a pre-integration governance style that gives us high governance coverage at the end of the day. So why do we have to do that? Why is it really hard? Well, the surface area of the data to govern it has increased significantly. And the old style of copying data actually reduces fidelity. In trying to govern your data, if you're copying it, you're actually fighting against yourself. Think about that. A lot of governance programs seek to say, okay, we're going to create another master copy of the data. We're going to conform everything to this master model, and it's going to be yet another copy of data somewhere. And then we're going to distribute it out to the folks who are going to use it, creating more copies. But every time you do that, you lose control. And you open up the door for more things to go wrong. But yet there are the expectations to automate and converge the activities between analysis and operations. David talked about this earlier, and Gary as well, the distinction between simply observing your business and running your business. You want to find out things about your business and act on them. And then, of course, there's a need for not just transparency, but efficiency and consistency. So I've actually added two themes. I couldn't change the title of this presentation. I was like, what if we added efficiency and consistency? You're too late. So I'll just add it in now. We're not just going to talk about transparency, but efficiency and consistency. So let's look at the aspects of governance. We're going to take that diagram that I had earlier, and we're going to look at things. So we got the drivers or regulation, market trends, opportunities perhaps. There are all these processes that result from the drivers. Then there are concepts that come out of that. There are policies, processes, programs, workflows, but then things like models, data dictionaries, and roles emerge. Okay, so that's cool. And then an application architecture is impacted. It could be an application architecture supporting an enterprise warehouse, service-oriented architecture, or line of business apps. And then at the lowest level is your data. And traditionally, the governance space actually focuses on this area. Okay, so now I'm not here to say that data governance vendors are bad. They're great, actually, and we work with a lot of them. What we're saying is that if you're just focusing on this area, there's still more to do. These areas, processes and concepts, are extremely important. They are necessary, but they're not sufficient. Some approaches to governance say, I'm going to focus on a specific regulation or a specific outcome, and I'm going to go deep, and that's great. But you haven't addressed the problem holistically. Earlier, Gary talked about one of our customers solving a MiFID II problem, but really they were solving a governance and integration problem as applied to MiFID II for now. But if you do this siloed approach, you haven't really solved your problem. You may have created more silos along the way. Some approaches kind of go in the middle and say, if we just put a virtualization layer on top, we could look at everything. But really, you're not governing everything. You're just actually looking at a horror show of, oh my God, my data is so ungoverned. So that's actually valuable in some sense. What we're saying is, to complete the picture, you need to have governance in the data layer. And that's where we come in. We allow a pace of change in the data layer around governance and a level of maturity around governance that is needed today. Okay, so this is a nice animation that I created. And if judging by my stick figures, you can probably judge what this is going to look like in a moment. So we've got regulation on one side. We've got innovation on the other. And actually, if you look at them, we think of them as the opposites or opposing forces, but in reality, they're very much related. Transparency is what you hear about from a regulation perspective. If you're an innovator, you hear about being data-driven. Consistency is what you hear about from a regulation perspective. If you're an innovator, focus is important. Efficiency on the regulatory side, time to market on the innovation side. These are really kissing cousins. They're two sides of the same coin, and at the center of it is data governance. You get this right, you balance regulation and innovation, and they don't get out of whack. So the problem, yes? Sure. That's a very good point. Yeah. So continuity. We'll just add them to both. That's a great point. Continuity, Archie. That's a great point. Yeah, and the business is exactly right. You can't freeze the world. You can't say stop everything while we govern everything. Business has to go on, and it's not just keeping the lights on, but it's all the innovation as well. Great point, Archie. Thanks for that. So for the MarkLogic World London session, I'm going to include that and give you credit. Appreciate it. So around all this is now governance, risk, and compliance. That's why they go together. And I'm going to add risk plus innovation. Innovation, remember, equals existential risk management. Okay? So when we say leveraging the data layer, what are we talking about? Well, lots of different things. So let's consider these scenarios. I don't always know where my data has come from. I don't have consistency in the results. And there's a growing need to provide more context around the data. And the process of fixing data quality issues is very convoluted and slow. So do any of these apply to you? I'm going to guess yes for Archie, unless she's getting shy all of a sudden. Okay, so after this, we're going to edit this for the London session. You want to co-present? Fly over to London. We could. So do these apply to any of you? Do they not apply to any of you? Raise your hand. Okay, so all of you. See what I did? I just tricked you guys. This is so if any of these do apply to you, the simple capability of being able to enrich your data goes a long way. It sounds trite, but by this I don't mean just attaching notes to the data that people can read. If you think about the things that you need to do to your data in real time in a governed, auditable, and transparent way, it's hard to do that with relational technology, which is pretty much the working horse of operational data today. So provenance, David talked about this earlier. It is the context around where did the data come from. And traditionally, this gets buried in code. Somebody writes code, they get the requirements, they go, okay, this is what I have to do to the data to transform it to create another state, and then the data goes somewhere else. Well, what we say is inside the same database where you do your integration, as you're transforming the data, record as data what is happening to the data. Record as data what is happening to the data. Pretty powerful concept. There's a W3C, I believe it's still a recommendation. I don't know if it's a recommendation or a standard, but a lot of people are using it called Prov-O, the provenance ontology. It's a way in which you can codify what happens to data using an ontology in a machine-readable format, in this case RDF. And so it's a pretty powerful concept. In fact, this is this image down here is from the W3C site. and it's like a primer on the provenance ontology. And in fact, there will be a session today, I believe. There's a session on the schedule around using the provenance ontology. So by all means, attend that if you get a chance. But simple concept. What happens to your data? Record it as data. It's interesting. You need it. It gives you the context of whether to know if your numbers are good. And then just simply asserting other facts. This is a powerful concept, and this has been around for a while. You know, there's a lot of talk about asserting facts in RDF, and there's talk about machine learning these days. We've actually been doing this for a while. It just hasn't necessarily been called machine learning. So partners with whom we work, and some of them are out there in the partner showcase, do natural language processing and semantic enrichment. They'll take a look at text, and they'll pull out facts and concepts about that text. And they use I think, linear algebra to do that, and that's machine learning. It's just machine learning on text. We're pulling out concepts. But what we do is we take those concepts, these chunks of information, and we allow you to do more with them. We say, okay, well, now what? Now that we've got these concepts, where do those concepts fit into a larger context? And so this concept of asserting facts is not just for things like text analytics, but you can apply the same concept to machine learning. It's just machine learning, as people think of it, is the quantitative example of the sort of the qualitative example when we talk about text analytics. But just like text analytics, when you've got silos of number crunching going on, and you make some assertions about what happens, okay, well, now what? Now what do you do with that? Well, things get really interesting when you capture that data as RDF, as facts, against an ontology, and then do things with them. So this actually increases governance by allowing you to not just record what happens to the data and why you got to certain aggregated results, but also by allowing you to do in-field data corrections, because you can safely put this information in. That's related to provenance. So what are the benefits to this simple concept called data enrichment? And I say that kind of glibly, but it is a simple concept, but it's really powerful when the enrichment that you do is machine readable. Well, certainly transparency is improved, provenance and lineage, instead of locked up in code, but efficiency for the cases where you might be doing some machine learning, okay, where you don't want necessarily the swivel chair integration. I've done some calculations, I found out something interesting, now what do I do with that? Well, you can think of capturing facts and attaching them to your data as machine-aided interpretation of analytics, of machine learning. And then consistency, the fact that you're decorating your data as needed improves data quality overall. Okay. Some other scenarios. You have multiple models, they all represent a valid perspective. Or you're having trouble creating a single model that covers all your needs. Or you've got enterprise metadata available, but it's locked up somewhere. It's not always accessible. It's sitting in a spreadsheet maybe, or sitting in a master data management system, or somewhere else, or a governance product. Or there are many complex interrelationships between your data that impact risk. So if any of these apply to you, start to think about more flexible data linking. Okay? We're going to go back to RDF again. RDF is a really powerful enabler. When we talk about documents plus triples, triples go a long way, particularly when used in conjunction with documents. Okay, so another definition, data dictionaries. I'll let you folks read that. I highlighted the one term that's of interest. What's also interesting is that the first two definitions come from IBM and Oracle. So yeah, they're going to have a bit of a view of what data dictionary should be. But I like the first one, a document describing a database or a collection of data. It's a document. I've got a document. It's a dictionary. I can imagine a big Webster's dictionary. It's a document. Or maybe it's a piece of middleware that extends or supplants the native data dictionary of a DBMS. Well, the problem with traditional data dictionaries, regardless of what those definitions are, is that if it's sitting in a document, it's passive. It's a spreadsheet. It's just another piece of information. It's like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, this entity, this attribute is of this type, and it comes from here, and this is what it means. Okay, great. Not a lot I can do with that. Or maybe it's an ERD, or actually the entity relationships in the database itself. And that's actually machine readable, but it's closed. It's a closed world scope. It's very specific to that model. And when you want to change your metadata, you have to change your whole model so it doesn't evolve. Or if you take this other approach of it's another piece of middleware, it's yet another silo. So these all have issues. What we're saying is, what if your dictionaries were links between your data? So take these three models. These are all important models: finance, HR, and finance. And how are they typically linked together? Well, if you got the spreadsheet, you've got this describes this describes that. And if you look at that spreadsheet and you're querying your data, then you might get an idea of how they're related. Or somebody will look at that spreadsheet, look at that data, write some code to mash it up and put it in another model, like here. Okay, that's one outcome. But if your data dictionaries were integrated, machine readable, and open, you could do a lot more. But don't take our word for it. So this is also from Wikipedia. And they talk about things you could do with data mapping, again with RDF. And they say this process will be accelerated if each application performed metadata publishing. Full automated data mapping is a very difficult problem. So this is like in the future, someday, well, the future is today. You will be able to do automated data mapping if you leverage RDF. And so that's what we propose, because we have the capability. So take these three models again, functional, HR, and finance in this example, kind of pivot them off to the side and draw the linkages between them using triples. And what you have is you have a model in its own right, co-resident with the data, linking all of these important models together. Now notice what hasn't happened. We haven't taken these models and come up with a least common denominator model and thrown away everything else. We've kept all of those models intact. And instead of a lowest common denominator intersection, we've got an enriched union of the data. It's a significant difference. And this is what we do with customers. So you've got models about the models defined by linkages. Okay, so the quick comparison here, because just checking how I'm doing on time. Okay. Oh, look at that. That's 12 minutes. Okay, he's covering now. I'm kidding. It's two. So we see the difference, right? We go from passive or siloed to active, executable, and integrated. Okay? And I think we'll have access to these slides later. The benefits are obvious. Explicit and contextual links between these disparate data sources stored alongside the data. It's very efficient because it's inside the database, and the consistency associated with automated data mapping. Yes, Archie, but keeping in mind I have 2 minutes. What's that? Oh, well, this is part of Q&A. So I've got extra time. Thank you, Archie, for giving me more time. Yeah, we're doing. Yes. That's a great point. That's right. And it's a great example. You combine the linking with the enrichment I talked about earlier. Yes, and there's a concept that we talk about sometimes we call like a two-way analysis, meaning discovery is not a read-only operation. Search and query is not a read-only operation. It's really powerful if it's a read-write operation, if you're asserting other things that you find back into the database in real time in a governable way, in a machine-readable way. In fact, we do a lot of that with in suspicious activity use cases, whether it's in defense and intelligence, know your customer, and anti-money laundering, and insider trading, where as you might be looking at lots of information and you see a connection that is obvious to you but not explicitly mentioned by the machine, you can do that. Create that linkage right there on the spot. That's a great point. Thanks for that. I think I meant to say that, but you kind of cued me there. And so Archie is not a plant. None of this is planned. This is actually real. So no, it's true. But thank you for that. Something I forgot to cover. Okay, so yes, those are the benefits. So one last point. So now we've got the this way, we've got a way to enrich the data, a way to link the data, combination of the two, as Archie mentioned. Let's talk about the policies themselves, where the policies get very complex. And the scenarios might be as follows. You work at a bank, and you deal with data privacy, and there's a jurisdictional component, multi-jurisdictional component to your data privacy. Perhaps you deal with asset management in the country of Switzerland. Sound familiar, right? You hear about Swiss banks and what the requirements are. You work at a company in Europe, and you've got to comply with GDPR, or regulations requiring increasingly complex data retention policies, and or onboarding customers is very laborious and manually intensive. What we do in the data layer is we give you tools, again, inside the data layer, to apply these policies at the lowest level possible, so that there's no mismatch between what people decide up front and that circuitous path that finally takes them to the data layer. It's declarative in the database. So David talked about them earlier. So whether it's the security that we build into MarkLogic, document and element level, redacting and masking, wouldn't it be great to just say, well, declare that in the database and make it so it doesn't have to be done in code. And if you have a distributed database, distributed shared nothing database, and you can partition your data in certain ways based on policy, then you could do some really cool stuff that if you happen to be, say, a bank, or you manage assets in Switzerland, and you have these coarse-grained constraints around where your apps can be, wouldn't it be great if you can manage things around where your data can be? Because that's ultimately what these regulations address. It has to do with where the data can be. But because a lot of these banks can't do anything below the app layer, that's where all the policy begins and ends. They write code and it's in the app. They have to take whole apps and say, this entire app has to be here and not here. Well, we take it to a lower level at the database level. And then all the other things. Least privilege assumption for operations and management and encryption at rest. There are going to be other sessions on this, so by all means, take a look at your guide. And then, what about making a policy that happens to mention data storage and retention directly in the regulation and make it executable by your database? Declarative and executable. So SEC 17A4, for any of you who work in banking, this is a regulation around retaining data. And the regulation specifically mentions things like worm devices and immutability of your data. So our capabilities, David mentioned them earlier, bitemporal and tiered storage, can be combined to meet this requirement right in the database. Wouldn't that be great? And then lastly, this is really a setup for the keynote tomorrow. Michael Henry is going to be speaking about a Know Your Customer, automation of the Know Your Customer process. And this is where you're taking an entire business policy and process. Right? So all those things I talked about in that layer, the policy and process layer, and automating all of that. Going from a stare and compare approach, where I'm looking at lots of data and trying to figure out how it's all related, and saying, let's make stare and compare the exception instead of the rule. Let the machine automate what it can based on policy, based on having all of the data it needs, not having to come up with a least common denominator compromise, having all of the data, all the context, and saying, well, now that I have all that, I can actually automate my policy and know when I have an exception. So then your exception pool goes down 2 orders of magnitude. So the keynote tomorrow is really going to drive this point home. So these are the benefits. Policies co-resident with the data, not buried in code, eliminating the translation layers, and minimizing human error. Okay, the recap. We're almost there, because then we have to take some questions. And we do have time for questions, which is great. Recap. GRC is always relevant, irrespective of the compliance climate. Okay? Remember 2008. You always have risk to worry about. The less compliance you have to worry about, the more risk you have to worry about that you may not know about. So you have to govern your data. There's a direct dependency on data governance for the GRC space. You get your data governance right, you've pretty much got your GRC right. You've got the foundation for a good GRC strategy. And the point here is, go to the lowest level possible. Don't stop at the top level around policies and processes. Complement that with the capabilities that a database like MarkLogic can provide to allow you to execute those policies where they belong in the database. now we could take more questions. I think Archie asked all the questions. Yes, Charles.
If you want to see how some of these things are done practically in code, in this room at 1, we've talked about entity services and a little demo which shows how to attach provenance information, data governance information to your data and how to enrich it.
Thank you for that. Yes. Other questions, plugs, comments, stories, horror stories? It's great, you know. I mean. Yes.
One of your slides was speaking about encryption at rest. Do you also do the encryption on the move for the data?
In transit. With SSL, yes. Yes. With
Is there
SSL.
any performance impacts on that one? Data performances?
I mean, Kyle, you could. You know, a lot of hardware technology has gone into making encryption as painless as it can be. There are a lot of things built into chipsets to deal with encryption. I don't know, but Kyle, you can probably speak more authoritatively on that.
Primarily REST as a way to talk to the database, and we support SSL, FIPS compliant for quite a long time. And in 9, we introduced encryption at rest.
And there was a follow-up question around the performance overhead, and I alluded to how a lot of the hardware is taking care of a lot of that.
So recent tests that we did, for instance, in Amazon, encryption at rest, 2 to 3% performance degradation, very, very low, due to new hardware.
Yeah. And if you think about 2 or 3% as your overhead, and the sort of increasing capability of hardware and scale out, it almost becomes a non-factor to consider whether to do it or not. If you could push a button and say, make everything encrypted and secure, why wouldn't you do it, right? Usually the gating factor is, well, I can't just push a button. But if you get the tools inside the database where you effectively can, then there's little excuse to not do it. Yes?
Hey, Ken, I was wondering if you could comment on an anti-pattern that we see in the field a lot. So we call it, we've even come up with an acronym for it. So we call it yet another useless data lake, or YOUDL. It's a point at which a data lake starts as a good idea, but there's some sort of scope creep around what it might ultimately become. And the next thing you have this ungoverned and hence really not usable. So just not usable repository of data. So comments on that, or how the GRC functionality that we have helps with that? Yeah,
no, it's a good point. So what I'm hearing a lot from in the industry now is it's about smart data lakes, right? You hear that a lot? We need smart data lakes. So what does that say about the other data lakes if these are going to be smart? So that's my comment to that. But it's true. You need to be smart about your data lakes. It's a great concept to say we want to put all of our data together, not make compromises about what we put in this one integrated place, give people the ability to discover perhaps the things they don't know about. That's a great concept. The fact is, you can't just mash it together and expect it to be meaningful, secure, and governed. You have to be smart about it. So, do we call what we do, a data lake? No, for a number of reasons. We talk about being an operational data hub because it's much more actionable. Businesses run off of the integrated data that usually goes into a MarkLogic database, and all the governance and security and enforcing the policies up front, pre-integration, is very important. And if you could do that without slowing down what you do when you integrate your data, well, then that's great, and that's what we do. Yes? So, 2 questions.
In one of your slides, you showed cross-functional data linkages.
Yes.
One of the challenges we see a lot in the world of finance is ability to consolidate data from different entities in the company, and then be able to do external and management reporting. Have you seen MarkLogic replace the Oracle multi-dimensional cubes?
So, okay, great question. So we've done a lot in financial services, and we've done a lot of things that Oracle could not do. Now, whether we, substituted for the Oracle multidimensional cubes or not is not really the question. It's more around sometimes people either use multidimensional cubes or a big OLAP engine or a big data warehouse and say, well, this is the pattern I have for integrating enterprise data, so let me see if I could solve this business problem, which is an enterprise data integration problem, with my data warehouse. And what they found is that they cannot. That whether it's the real-time aspects, the operational aspects, or the need to have all of the different shapes of your data preserved without mashing them into one model, that's what we've been doing. So we've been doing that since 2009, 2010. And if you think back of one of the things I mentioned earlier, I talked about getting involved on the back of existential crises. It's no coincidence that we got our first mission-critical financial services use case starting in 2009 because of what happened in 2008. The largest holder of credit default swaps at the time, I believe their entire OTC derivatives portfolio was around 70 trillion. They came to us and said, we've got all of these different silos of data, and we can't even create the model to represent them. They're all trades, but they all look very different. Interest rate swaps look one way, credit default swaps look another, equity derivatives look another, but all that information is important, but the regulator's breathing down our neck, and we have this post-trade processing that we need to do on all of that. Can you help us? And so I would say the answer is absolutely, because we have to retain those different shapes of data. Particularly if you don't know what the next thing is that the regulator is going to ask for. So the answer to your question is yes, but perhaps not in the way that you would envision, where we're like a drop-in replacement. The idea of a drop-in replacement is not really the approach that we take. What we ultimately find is there's a missing piece of the architecture puzzle that we identify. It's not quite a warehouse. It's not a function-only sort of data hand-wavy, service-oriented architecture. It's not an ungoverned lake. It's something else that needs to go in the middle of all that. That doesn't preclude using all those other three patterns, but it's a pattern. We just call it the operational data hub. And it is exactly that. It is all of those models, all have meaning, linkages across all those models, and reporting, analysis, and sometimes cross-line of business use cases against the universe of those models. Yes?
Hi. You talked about the provenance of the data, and in the application we have, we rely on that. But you also showed the governance model of all the steps in the process,
yeah,
which works fine for an initial implementation. But there's a provenance of that process, of the governance itself as well, sort of a feedback loop.
Yeah.
That anytime the regulations change, you have to be able to demonstrate that you've done something about it, even if it says, I didn't have to do anything, somebody's name is on it.
Great use case.
And we've had to address that for customers as well.
Oh, that's a great question. One of our first use cases with an investment bank that is here this week was actually on a policy portal. It started out with, here's the regulation, here's the policy we came up with, show me how they map together, and record what happens in the workflow. High level, lighter touch, it was at the top layer of that diagram, but we've been doing that for years with other customers. Now that we're actually encoding policy inside the database, you bring up an interesting point about connecting all those dots. Yeah. Great. Yeah, great point. And you're from? I'm sorry? India. Okay. Is that it as far as the questions go?
That's it.
Okay.
Thank you all.
Thank you.